the presentation.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Edgar. Is the screen sharing working? I can't see the chat, so just give me a wave if it is not, Edgar. Um, though your movement suggests something might not be working. So I'll just pause for a moment. Okay, everything's okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining today, and thank you for arranging this. I'm really grateful to get a chance to run some ideas by everyone here, and thank you to Dr. Tunanuche for agreeing to serve and taking the time to be the respondent. I've been floating around these topics for some time, but really worked them out, I think, during the pandemic. And so they haven't been aired as widely as I would have liked. And so I'm really grateful for any feedback anyone may have. So in 1977, the Uganda Commercial Bank sent J.M. Kashobia to Kagadi. The trip was meant to be an exploratory visit, doing the rounds to see if the UCB might want to expand in due course to the town in western Uganda. Yet the visiting banker's arrival turned into something of a spectacle, as residents appeared in droves to insist that he open them savings accounts. As he reported to his superiors, quote, people started opening up accounts to show the support they had for the bank, and they contributed more than 50,000 shillings in spite of the fact that it had not been known before that collections would be accepted. Evidently impressed, and perhaps feeling something like a reciprocal obligation to these popular offerings, Mr. Kashobia made the case for opening a new branch in Kagadi, saying almost anything can grow here, he crowed, while listing the names of, quote, outstanding progressive farmers and other entities that would be likely customers. On its present merits, a Kagadi branch would be a, quote, undoubted success, but with the expectation that it would soon become a district headquarters, it was all the more deserving. So my talk today looks at such events as indicative of a style of economic nationalism that's not unique to Kagadi, let alone Uganda. It emerges from a book project that looks across Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda to consider how decolonization occasioned various efforts to remake economic production, trade, and consumption. At stake in political sovereignty was the ability to exert economic sovereignty, and this had attendant implications for the nature of citizenship in the three post-colonies. Economic self-determination was so salient in the 1960s and 70s because East Africans did not only experience colonialism as a denial of political rights, they also clamored for long-denied commercial liberties, including the right to open shops, export their crops, and receive loans. Oftentimes, this political and economic history was so entwined as to be indistinguishable, and economic uplift was seen as formative of political advance. And while the struggles over cooperatives and export agencies, let alone trade licenses, are well known, certainly to the people in this meeting, my goal is to suggest that too often in recent work, they have tended to be divorced from political and cultural histories, especially studies of citizenship, which have tended to focus since the 1990s on questions of racial and ethnic identity, questions of law and the customary, and questions of cultural authenticity and belonging. We might speculate in our conversation about why this diminution of the economic has occurred or its divorce from the political and cultural has occurred. But today I'd like to lay out some of the history and suggest some of the ways that we might think about this to bring them back together. At the core of my interests are a range of financial initiatives and monetary instruments pioneered in the 1950s, very much, I think, the background to the sorts of demands in Kagadi in 1977. In the wider project, I used the archives of the Bank of Uganda, among others, to discuss the creation of a national currency and how that served to kind of create a territorial economy for Uganda, erected in the years after 1965, progressively divorcing from Kenya and Tanzania. I also discuss a novel effort to sell so-called premium development bonds to citizens. With denominations as low as 5 shillings, the goal here was to find new sources of funding for the state, thereby incorporating citizens' own savings into a national resource that could be governed by the Bank of Uganda. But today I'd like to focus on the Uganda Credit and Savings Bank, established in 1950, and its successor, the Uganda Commercial Bank. These were critical and conflict-ridden initiatives to expand banking in Uganda, equal parts economic, political, and cultural efforts, I will argue. But before doing so, it's worth briefly noting the range of efforts in the colonial era to dispute the prevailing political economy. So in Kenya, Harry Thuku's pioneering work was in part motivated by the restrictions on African coffee cultivation. The Luo Thrift and Trading Corporation, established by Odinga, combined ethnic patriotism with entrepreneurial initiative. Both of Tanganyika's successful coffee growing communities rioted in the 1937s over the limits imposed on cultivation. And in Buganda, of course, a series of widespread protests in the 40s were galvanized by frustrations over the price paid for cotton, the role of Asian intermediaries, and the regulation of farmer cooperatives. To the east, Bagisu coffee farmers similarly insisted on better prices and protocols for selling their crops. To the west, the Bwambo Renzori Growers Association carried on an extended campaign for their own coffee processing plant and less exploitative middlemen. Across the region, people were vocal and lucid in petitioning for the transformation of commercial regulations. They appeared at government inquiries, they wrote letters, they made submissions to officialdom. So, for instance, when the East African Royal Commission was established in 1953 to explore economic development and the social problems, as they put it, attendant with economic change, people appeared and wrote many submissions to present their economic troubles and propose solutions. My sense is that scholarly assessments of the Commission have largely dismissed it as a misguided effort obsessed with private land and land ownership and the specter of detribalization. Yet for many at the time, the official inquiry was an appropriate stage for positioning themselves as worthy economic actors. Stephen Gashina here from Naivasha, for instance, condemned being debarred from wealth. Such a condition threatened his own masculine standing in the world, and simultaneously, he thought, contributed to political problems in Kenya. Of course, this is 1953. As he wrote, being given freedom to advance economically was the context for his claim. Being given this freedom will make an African feel like he is a man like the men of other races here, and will show him that they are not envious of him, and it will free him from fear of them, because he will realize, although that these races continue to dwell here, he will be happy here in his own country and not afraid of being deprived his right. Among other things, at the Commission, East Africans demanded more loans be provided to their commercial ventures. The Kenyan African Union branch in Nyanza, for instance, noted that only non-Africans would receive bank loans at the time, despite the needs of African traders and farmers. Mr. Siganga, who was the president at the time of the Abaluya People's Association, concurred, saying that more credit must flow and that it must be matched by improved training facilities, commercial training facilities, things like bookkeeping. In Uganda, the Uganda Growers Cooperative Union, which claimed to represent 10,000 members in Buganda, rued that African interest in First is that beyond calls for legal belonging and political rights alone, Ugandans of various statuses and classes and communities argued that the reorganization of economic rules, infrastructures, and practices was necessary. Second, while Buganda has received a lion's share of attention both at the time and in subsequent scholarly assessments, such economic claims making was not limited to Buganda. And finally, the sorts of economic demands that were often the sorts of economic demands that people made were often the sorts of demands most intelligible to the British, and often the ones to which the British were most sympathetic. So there's a proliferation of demands in this period, but these were the ones that Britain could make sense of and to which they were sympathetic. So the Commission of Inquiry in 1949 into the so-called disturbances in Buganda, for instance, one of the few things to which the commissioners had any sympathy was Muzazi's call for an agricultural bank. They thought this was one of the few legitimate grievances at the time. And of course, the colonial state had its own reason for this kind of selective hearing and sympathy. They had their own export-oriented revenue imperatives that made them amenable to such calls. So there's a sort of mutualism here, a kind of shared interest among certain people. And so as a result, as the protectorate subjects transitioned, haltingly, imperfectly to be sure, into Ugandan citizens, their rights and responsibilities as producers were at the forefront of concerns. And so I'm thinking about these forms of petitioning the state and calling upon it to act financially as credible citizenship. This was a formation that emerged before independence, but it solidified in the years after. Citizens of Kenya, Uganda, and what became Tanzania positioned themselves as reliable producers. To be a credible citizen was to be a trustworthy recipient of a loan, a viable manager of a shop, the essential producer of a cash crop. With independence, the colonial discrimination and political interests that made it possible to deny economic liberties to Africans faded, and citizens were therefore legal citizens were therefore better able to demand their entrance into further market domains. And in each case, the commercial rights of credible citizenship were yoked to responsibilities. So shopkeepers, for instance, were expected to contribute taxes. Income for all was expected to be saved in banks, where it could therefore be converted into loans distributed to others. Above all, though, the responsibility of credible citizenship was to expand export value. Credible citizenship was therefore formative of a kind of productivist ethos, in which the kind of virtues of output were extolled, and those who were unable to yield fruitful work were consequently denigrated. Merit in this formation was revealed through industrious contributions to the collective political economy. Deviations from it were incurred discipline, sometimes to the point of state violence. Engaging in productive market activity was a way to earn both money and social and official esteem. It provided a means to achieve a range of culturally salient aspirations, from affording the material trappings of married life. Think about Mr. Gishina from Naivasha and his demands to become a man equal with other men, to educating one's children. So credible citizenship here was a way of legitimating one's position within a regime of economic self-determination. So in one register, it was through this exercise of productive potential that belonging in the polity was justified. And in this way, it was felt, I think, quite generally throughout the populace, not only within small enclaves of the well-to-do. But more often, I think it was a means of justifying what at the time were severe limitations on resources, by fashioning oneself as more deserving than others. And so in this way, it was a practice of distinction. Credible citizenship, therefore, was always unequal and exclusionary, and the standards of citizenship were routed through economic modalities characterized by risk, by competition, by profit. The areas that were conducive to earning export value, they produced a class of cultivators who could advocate on their own behalf. For states, there was a material interest to direct more resources to these areas if it was deemed that they could boost export value. What resulted from this productivism was a masculine regime of control, as export crops were sold and money was governed in ways that diminished the role of many women, even as they labored in the fields. Over time, to be sure, more women found a form of freedom in the markets of East Africa's cities and towns. They traded the obligations and iniquities of rural life for some form of economic opportunity, even if precarious and compelled. But just as frequently, their burden was doubled by the compulsion to produce and earn export value, coupled with the work of caring and raising children. And in few cases was the work that women were doing the sort of economic activity that the state saw as legitimate, let alone essential, let alone honorable and deserving official support. And so I think it's within this context that we should see the Uganda Credit and Savings Bank. It was established in 1950, and it was understood by the colonial officials who did so as a response to popular demands for commercial expansion. In an era of buoyant export prices, it also promised to expand the state revenue from coffee and cotton. The Uganda Credit and Savings Bank and the African Loans Fund that it administered were important departures from prior official policy, financial policy. Both were the result of African activism in prior years, not least by productive, wealthy farmers and a new class of African traders. And it was biased towards those wealthy traders, especially those in the already privileged sectors of Buganda. Ugandans without land titles, migrant workers who tilled the fields, and others hovering in subsistence could not access these new financial resources in the same way. And in this way, I think UCSB was a harbinger for post-colonial monetary initiatives that may have once held the promise of wider access, but often led to shoring up and producing new inequalities and wealth and power. So let me explain how the UCSB worked. It was initially with £500,000, which came from the price stabilization funds of coffee and cotton exports. But it sought to expand its own capital by recruiting savings accounts as well. So initial efforts in this regard were in 1956, and subsequently the UCSB was deemed, quote, ingenious in encouraging and collecting small savings, with more than 29 million shillings held in 50,000 accounts by 1961. Government employees could have their part of their salaries automatically diverted into their savings account. And the UCSB even started a school savings scheme or expense and frequent breakdowns. Ugandans flocked to these mobile banks and demanded that their routes and number be expanded. The most important UCSB role, however, was the issuance of loans to Ugandans. Demand at the time was considerable. On the day it opened its doors in 1950, there was an immediate rush for application forms, and within 3 months, 830 applications had already been issued. Of these, 166 were approved, with more than £100,000 lent. All but 3 of these loans, these 166, were secured against Milo land, a topic to which I'll return. In the coming years, the demand would continue, with the number of staff and offices and loans for the UCSB expanding. These overwhelmingly went to agricultural purposes, but the loans also financed new buildings, shopkeeping, brickmaking, and other businesses. By the end of the decade, the demand for loans continued unabated, and more streamlined services were being offered to what was called at the time progressive farmers, who adopted farm techniques under the supervision and at the direction of agricultural extension officers. By 1957, the Uganda Credit and Savings Bank had distributed 14,000 loans through the African Loans Fund, 12,000 of which were in Buganda. The unequal distribution of credit reflected a number of influences beyond the peculiarity of the Milo land regime. Partly it reflected the existing prosperity and political favor directed by Britain towards Buganda. It also reflected proximity to export infrastructure, familiarity with the procedures governing cash crops, and non-farm employment opportunities for landholders. Buganda also had better ways of convincing the new bankers that they were an appropriate credit risk. So one method to do so was by having the royal government guarantee 50% of the loan in case of default. So all African local governments were offered this ability to kind of backstop 50% of the loans. But of course, Buganda, the kingdom, was comparatively rich and well integrated with its wealthy farmers. And when it began backstopping their borrowing in 1956, it unlocked considerable lending. In the first year after that, more than 10,000 application forms were requested in Buganda, with over 200 completed applications arriving at the office of the bank every week. So this was a sea change. In 1950, one study of Milo land had found very little mortgaging of this land. By 1965, so a decade and a half later, the large survey overseen by Audrey Richards found widespread borrowing from government schemes and private banks as well. About half of the coffee farmers sampled in that study received loans from the UCSB, and almost all who had diversified into commercial farming drew on such bank credit to do so. The inequality in the distribution of credit did not go unnoticed. In Busoga, residents were frustrated by the limited lending by the UCSB in their region. Would it not be more useful, one shopkeeper wrote in May 1953, for all people to receive loans, for it enlarges our trading if somebody is allowed to be given such money and shows an improvement. By mid-1955, only 6 out of 50 loan applications had been approved from Busoga. In Kigezi, the number was even lower. And even within Buganda, credit was unavailable to many who wanted loans. So the Uganda Growers Cooperative Union complained in 1953 that while the UCSB was initially welcomed, quote, our joy was short-lived when it was brought home to us that the credit bank would only give credit to the landed class, those fairly well-to-do class of people who, in the nature of things, are usually unwilling to do the dirty work, that is, work demanding physical exertion or a lot of trouble before giving returns. The Uganda National Congress likewise complained that what initially seemed to be, quote, a godsend to an acute need actually had proved to be disappointing because 95% of Ugandan Africans, in their estimation, could not provide the land or other immovable property demanded as collateral. For these critics, the trouble was not only inequality of access, but also how loans furthered existing inequalities within Ugandan society. Those without existing resources, those who could not marshal sufficient property or who were located too far away from transport infrastructure, they would fall even further behind. And yet, the British were obsessed with lending against title deeds. This wasn't merely the financial conservatism of British banking. At least in the view of the World Bank team, who visited in 1961, the colonial fixation on landed collateral, on titling, which directed much government effort in the 1950s, this fixation had much to do with race, what they called race relations. Banks, the World Bank wrote in their draft report, could, quote, do more in the way of extending credit on the basis of character. Creditworthy character, they thought, was the result of the growth of the money mentality and respect for debt obligation. However, the World Bank thought that bankers, including at the UCSB, had little way to know and judge the character of potential African borrowers due to the way in which various communities in Uganda tend to keep to themselves in their social life. Overcoming these racial hierarchies through greater, what the World Bank called social interrelations, was a necessary component of furthering African enterprise, which by 1961, was very much a broad-based goal. But over time, across the 1950s, there was something of a begrudging escape from some of the racial and propertied strictures of finance. Ugandan subjects continued to demand credit be deployed in ways that challenged British parsimony and bias. The result was lending that sutured together various purposes, not all of which fit together neatly. Bankers and agricultural extension officers who served on the front line of government lending were at pains to direct capital to what they viewed as productive investment. Revenue and resource imperatives favored certain areas, but there was a continued effort to disagree over what would be the purposes of this lending. So the bank wanted it to go to fertilizers, farm workers, and other commercial ends, but they often encountered low repayment rates as people spent the money on other things. One thing that the UCSB finally agreed to lend against that they deemed not a commercial proposition were radios. They said this wouldn't be economic, but they agreed to finance the purchase of radios with loans because at the time radios had great promise in colonial circles as a means of inexpensive governance and pedagogy. And so in practice, Lending to Africans at this kind of final moment of colonial political control was not reducible to profit and loss. There were non commercial purposes that required a wider assessment of success. They saw the UCSB as having a kind of pedagogical role of inculcating a certain type of mentality within borrowers. And there was also efforts to do more like humanitarian purposes. So officials spoke of, quote, granting loans to assist the public, but others would then worry about default and profitability. And so borrowers had to carefully position themselves somewhere between deserving subjects of colonial welfarism and promising customers with a market motivation. Not all could meet the standards expected of borrowers. So I mentioned earlier the exclusion of women. Of course, women were not completely excluded from commercial economy in the 1950s. In Uganda, women could own land. One sample from 1950 of 687 Milo plots found 70 female landowners, most of whom who had inherited or been given the land. The wives of large farmers, of course, had a role in supervising farm labor. Yet in most cases, the sale of the crops from the ginneries and the processing colonial. In due course, these late colonial experiments would be adopted, expanded, and reformed by the independent state. The broader array of post colonial financial instruments would hail Ugandans as credible citizens, offering them resources for pursuits insofar as they contributed to the nation's development. Politicians extolled the duties that went along with these new resources, carrying out trainings, supervision, and audits of borrowers. So, if credible citizenship was disciplinary in these cases, it was also exclusionary, as I'll talk more about below. The post colonial financial regime was worked out by a small group of Ugandan officials and expatriates. Chief among them was Jack Shitongo, the secretary to the Treasury, Joseph Mubiru, who first ran the UCSB before leading the Bank of Uganda, and Lawrence Kulule Satala, who was the Minister of Finance. Walter Newlin, a monetary economist from Leeds University, and George Hoskins, who was Obote's personal economics advisor, were also important, as were the IMF, the World Bank, and the East African Currency Board. It's important to be clear about the timeline here, I think. The Currency Board ended in 1965-66, so that is years after independence. The reasons for this, that kind of delayed introduction of central banking, was in part around the East African Federation and an affiliated regional central bank that would continue to run a regional currency. At least that was the goal. The fact of establishing a new monetary architecture in 1966 is also important, as folks here know, due to the crisis that gripped Uganda in that year. Earlier development efforts had failed to get off the ground, and the government was struggling to find external aid from anywhere beyond Britain. Government costs were deemed to be too high at the time, but it was difficult to cut back on the most evident category of expenses, namely payments to farmers, because Obote's government thought it would prove politically disastrous, both in the north, where he had his constituency, and in the south, where he was already on his back foot. And because the state was spending more than it thought it could afford, the Bank of Uganda was directed to quickly consolidate wealth in usable forms for the state. But this was troubled by the turmoil in Uganda, with the violent crescendo in the first half of 1966. An important part of the subordination of Buganda involved what Apollo Nsibambi once called seizing the financial sinews of the kingdom. And this kind of conflict also threw into question the role of financial technocrats like Joseph Mubiru, who had been expected to take the reins at the Bank of Uganda, but was therefore called into question given the conflict and his background. Observers at the time were not even sure that the Bank of Uganda was legal due to the constitutional crisis. And more importantly, it was unclear if ordinary Buganda would accept the new Ugandan currency, which was going to be issued, or whether it would be too symbolically associated with Obote and the new financial powers of his government. Fortunately, from the perspective of the Bank of Uganda, the new currency was due to be issued at the same time as payments to Robusta coffee farmers, meaning that whatever Gonda kind of ethnic patriotism existed would be confronted by the threat of not receiving payment for one's coffee, which would be issued in this new currency. And so as a result, the currency entered the economy relatively smoothly. Within this context, Obote's government gave the Uganda Commercial Bank pride of place with considerable expansion beginning in 1966. If managed properly, government banking offered additional policy latitude for the state. And the UCB is essentially a kind of rebranding and expansion of the UCSB, the colonial initiative I've just been discussing. They did a range of new initiatives, often financed by foreign aid. For instance, in the 1960s, the US government and the World Bank provided finance to expand agricultural lending considerably. But as before, credit was not only a financial instrument. Loans were political promises before they were promissory notes. There was also a pedagogical instrumentality here. The idea was to reform borrowers. It wasn't merely being a legal citizen that justified access to credit. Rather, the post-colonial state offered its capacity to redistribute money across time to those that it deemed worthy. Troubles with repayment obliged the state to target citizens that it deemed most credible, to the detriment of smaller, less legible borrowers. They adopted the colonial language of, quote, progressive farmers, who were depicted as a vehicle for increased agricultural productivity, but in practice, it was often a code word for wealthy cultivators and landowners. And as a result, some Ugandans turned to, as a result of this kind of exclusionary nature, some Ugandans turned to supplication and petition, adopting the posture of clientelism. So one group of self-identified boys and girls wrote in 1970 that, quote, "We are crying with sorrowful voices because we are always too behind in everything. We wish to build a shop that can be called the Toro Boys Trading Company. Yet because we are young people, we have failed to collect the necessary capital. Please, sir, will the government help us with this capital?" For these youth, credit was a means to move forward in social time, an instrument not merely of economic well-being, but also a tool for achieving respectable adulthood. Popular demand for loans involved citizens calling upon the state as a source of redistribution, but not so much between classes, I think, as between generations. They cast the state in the figure of a senior authority who could rework wealth across the years of a loan, making it available after decades of colonial foreclosure. The UCSB was not only focused on loans, it was also focused on what Joseph Mubiru called mobilizing savings. As he put it, this would help the country deal with, quote, the problem of encouraging the small man to save his current earnings for his future, but also for the overall well-being of the economy. So this was a political and economic project, but it was also cultural. It would convert, in his view, wasteful subjects into economizing citizens. Citizens were encouraged to adopt new technologies for ensuring their credibility, including cooperative farming and bookkeeping. This would reform citizens in alignment with the demands of economic sovereignty, turning individual wealth into a collective resource. And more importantly, it would expand the resources that UCB had to issue loans for development financing. They had ambitious goals. The 1966 five-year plan called for £150 million to be invested from increased domestic savings. The IMF thought this was an unlikely amount to be achieved, but there was actually quite a good deal of optimism as the Bank of Uganda reported that there was a steady increase in savings deposits, which suggest, in their view, the growing spread among the public of the banking habit. And within 4 years of opening, the Uganda Uganda Commercial Bank deposits had increased by more than 50%, and lending followed suit. And in 1970, it made a profit of 3.2 million shillings. Cultivating this banking habit required enrolling the public in new systems for distributing and evaluating wealth. So by moving private hoards of personal savings into the banking system and then leveraging them to make loans, proponents aim to gather and shift wealth into more desirable forms of wealth. They understood this as a task of aligning personal interest with collective interest. So unlike, say, taxes, it was a voluntary way of expanding the fiscal power of the state. It was marketed as a means of merging the personal and public interest. And citizens could contribute to the state while also improving their own lot in life. District officers were called upon to spread the word about the safety of bank accounts and the benefits of earning interest on them. For business people, banking was said to serve as a window into their own success and virtue, leaving behind an accounting record that showed that they were, quote, not using your money for drinking purposes. Safely away from money, banking could therefore produce moral rectitude, not merely reveal it. And indeed, as petty traders positioned themselves as worthy of government license or investment, they would proudly, in their petitions at the time, affirm their status as a bank customer. There was confusion. The governor of the Bank of Uganda worried that people thought the purpose of a savings account was merely to give safe custody of their money, and that alone. But he saw it as an instrument for encouraging thrift and turning savings into investment. If the task was merely safeguarding from theft or damage, citizen savers wouldn't fully appreciate the importance of banking. And so he had a kind of role in spreading this knowledge. The UCB pursued an ambitious expansion of branches. The map here is a map from, I think, 1970 of their expansion. So in 1960, they were in 15 towns, but by the end of the decade, there were 123 banking offices in 66 locations, plus mobile vans that would periodically move around remote locations. Their expansion also provided more pressure on Barclays to expand their services. But as the economy stumbled in the 1970s, the importance of centralizing value didn't disappear, it actually increased. After the coup in 1971, banking continued to be an important infrastructure of statecraft. No longer, said Idi Amin, would the government neglect the masses of people in favor of only a few progressive farmers. Instead of growing paper in offices, as he put it, they would help people grow crops in the field. An early Amin decree established a new Uganda Development Bank to be capitalized with 130 million shillings. Of course, he was keen to position himself as the steward of the nation and its African economy. But he still spoke in this kind of financial idiom of saying that we would only judge loans strictly on their merits. And yet, he positioned himself as a kind of man of the people, a sort of financial populism, saying that they would include marginal borrowers with neither sufficient security nor previously ascertainable business experience to allow for a rapid expansion of business. For the government, bank branches were a prominent display of their much-touted effort to take services to the people. The UCB's expansion continued in the 1970s. A 1974 plan called for 28 more sub-branches that were aimed to expand banking for government offices and the people at large. They had a kind of nested hierarchy in which formal branches and then sub-branches and then agencies, which would only be visited on a kind of weekly or monthly basis, expanded throughout the geography. And yet, as you can see in this map, the expansion of branches still reflected the uneven economy of the territory, with the infrastructurally dense and export-oriented south predominating over the north. But banking was also a political affair. So Idi Amin used the branch opening in Mbarara and elsewhere to stage his munificence and technocratic credentials. In 1975, officials from the Bank of Uganda Bank Supervision Division looked at Bombo, north of Kampala, and they thought, no, it can't actually support a bank branch, so we shouldn't open there. But Idi Amin weighed in when visiting the army barracks there and saying that every provincial headquarters should have full-time banking facilities, yet Bombo was the only one without such facilities. There was also vocal demand for banking, with citizens speaking on behalf of the nation's interests. So, to pick one example, throughout the 1970s, the local government officials in Kakumiru maintained a steady stream of complaints, petitions, and inquiries to the Uganda Commercial Bank. The nearest bank branch was 60 miles away, and they said that this necessitated unbelievable sums of money without proper security being moved about the country. Local government reported anxiety, both in the business world and in official circles, leading to, quote, that notorious question that I face almost daily: when is the bank coming? They offered a variety of ways of appealing, including the very rich agricultural land that they had there, saying that this is in the nation's interest to have banking here and to facilitate our export-oriented growth, as well as food crops for the rest of the country. But if this was not a profitable venture, they wrote, reminding the UCB management that you are, quote, a public corporation with obligations beyond profit. And their lack of service in Kakumiru exposed the fiscus to great risks from robbery, embezzlement, as taxes and school fees and agricultural payments were left outside of formal banking. They said, if it's not profitable, then so be it. Humanitarian considerations may prevail over profit motives. Now, despite the considerable expansion from colonial days, the banking system remained unequal, as this map suggests. More importantly, it was also productive of inequalities. So in 1970, the Bank of Uganda did a study, and they found that 72% of bank deposits and 80% of loans and advances, so the vast majority of both deposits and loans, were concentrated in 4 districts: East and West Mengo, Mubende, and Busoga. Other districts actually served as sources of funds for these more privileged geographies. So Chigezi was perhaps the most stark, with 8 times as many deposits put by residents in Chigezi as loans were issued there. But this inequality, this form of funneling deposits towards wealthier areas, was also a problem in Toro, in Nkole, in Acholi, in West Nile, and in Bunyoro. It seems, they wrote, that the banking system operates to pump money from poorer counties into the most developed parts of Uganda, adding to the process of concentration. While some might insist, as the officials in Kakumiru did, that this was a public corporation and humanitarian considerations must countervail against profit, in practice, these were not very effective registers of appeal, and they offered at best, I think, a muted egalitarianism. So the expansion of banking was part of an effort to govern economic activity, and it inaugurated in the post-war years, and it continued after independence. While I've said less about the marketing boards and the work of the central bank, including the national currency, these initiatives were all arrayed next to each other in an effort to incorporate and expand wealth. This was to be on the terms established by the state. As we know, those who controlled their earnings in ways that contravened the nation state, including Asians, but also many borderland residents who subverted the territorial control of the economy, these folks were subject to discipline and violence. Yet the remaking of the economy was not merely pushed from on high. There were active demands from Ugandans that money, credit, and the law be redirected. They cast themselves as credible citizens, people who were worthy of resources and status by dint of their role as productive contributors to national progress. Most significantly, credible citizens emphasized their role in earning export value, and in doing so, they responded to the state's own imperatives to acquire foreign monies on which to finance its domestic aspirations. The claims of credible citizenship were in part a call for unmaking certain hierarchies, not least of which was the racial ordering of colonial capitalism, yet it was also productive of the new inequalities on which I've dwelled. But in closing, I want to reflect a little bit more on sovereignty, nationalism, and citizenship. Now, many studies of nationalism emphasize how citizens are convinced to contribute to a wider good, even to the point of self-sacrifice, even unto death. Cultural attachments, patriotic sentiments, these subordinate individual direction to collective purpose. Yet, independent Uganda never marshaled a very significant cultural nationalism, divided as it was between subnational loyalties and violence. Economic citizenship, I think, tried to sidestep these limited affective solidarities by weaving together monetary ties and financial interdependencies. So a national currency, which I discuss in the book, is perhaps the most evident example of this. So promulgating a national currency created shared interests and demarcated the boundaries of the nation. Deployed across the country, the currency incorporated Baganda landholders, Banyarwanda migrant workers, Karamojong pastoralists, Bakonjo separatists, all who wanted to legally transact within the country. In place of a cultural nationalism, Uganda's independence technocrats designed a financial architecture that wove together a nation and financed a state. It reflected the insistence of late colonial subjects that they were contributors not only to their own welfare, but to the nation's bottom line. And yet, I think credible citizenship trades social fraternity and solidarity for enterprising accumulation. Provided a model only so long as the promise of collective and individual advance held together. And yet, by the 1970s, the mid-1970s, this alignment of personal and collective interests became harder and harder to maintain. Magendo, hoarding, mispricing, these were the names attached to economic behaviors that contravened the state's claim to economic sovereignty. So my emphasis here, I think, differs from studies of ethnic identity that emphasize how ethnic identity have impeded a national project. It also places less importance on legal categories of belonging. There's no doubt that these are important, and I've suggested, I think, some ways that they inflected the dynamics that hold my attention. But I think most critical, and for which I'd be very grateful on feedback, is how the focus on what I'm calling credible citizenship differs from social citizenship. So in the influential theories of the British sociologist T.H. Marshall, social citizenship was layered upon earlier forms of civic belonging or civic standing. Social citizenship was constituted by a kind of softening of capitalist volatility and deprivation by using the state to redistribute surplus to those who were unable to work, either because they were temporarily unwell, because they were children, or because they were retired from work. Frederick Cooper influentially argued based on his studies of workers and labor relations in French and British colonial Africa, that such ideas of social citizenship guided and misguided decolonization. But I think in contrast to a study of workers and employment relations, credible citizenship shows that there were little claims to egalitarian redistribution. It did not require much in the way of manufacturing a welfare state, with taxes collected and spent on schools and healthcare and pensions. To be sure, these things did happen, but I think there's a risk of overstating the extent to which social citizenship and the solidarities and interdependencies that implies cohered across East Africa. Few at the time thought there were meaningful enough resources to do meaningful redistribution. The importance of the development ideology was that a larger pie could be created tomorrow, therefore lessening the importance of redistribution in the present. And in many cases, hierarchical ideas about dependence and worth militated, I think, against significant redistribution. Instead, what prevailed were ideas about the right to transact, to open businesses, and to receive loans. What I'm calling productivism, an ideology that links output with virtue, limited the possibilities of the nation, of the public, of the social. Indeed, it made citizenship hierarchical and unequal and exclusionary, not, I think, dissimilar to many places around the world where that also maintains. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating material. And I'll just hand it directly over to our discussant, Dr. Nicholas Tudernucci, for his comments and questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Taylor, for this opportunity. And thank you very, very, very much, Dr. Kevin Donovan, for sharing this about this important topic. And the book is indeed a must read for economic historians. I am going to make 7 comments, and then afterwards I ask 4 questions. So those 4 questions, you are at liberty to either answer them or leave them. In any case, this is very, very a fluid topic, which ignites a lot of debates, especially regarding the socio-economics of Uganda. I would like to start with how Kevin teases out and uses archives at the Bank of Uganda, which I think historians can also utilize archives of institutions to reconstruct history. Uganda Credit and Savings Bank, established in 1950, is of great interest indeed to economic historians to explain the current day mushrooming savings and credit cooperative societies, called them SACCOs, in Uganda as vehicles of economic development, which is actually not new. These SACCOs, of course, are lending at very low rates compared to commercial banks, but of course are regulated by the state. Whether they were formed by the credible citizens in the post-colonial Uganda, to borrow the words of Kevin, credible citizens in post-colonial Uganda to liberate themselves from poverty, as the credible citizens during the colonial times used to liberate themselves from economic subjugation imposed by the colonial state, and of course leading to several riots as he narrated them, petitions, protests, currency changes, makes the subject and the presentation very fascinating indeed, and actually timely for Ugandan economists and any other person who is bothered about understanding Uganda's economy. Second, beyond calls for legal belonging and political rights were indeed economic or commercial rights. Hence, Kevin claims that all the pointed out forms of petitions or petitioning to the state by the East Africans, calling upon the state to act financially as credible citizenship in practice, and the credible citizens positioning themselves as credible producers, trustworthy recipients of loans, viable managers, with the managers of shops and essential producers of cash crops, trying to bring about and stand for the agency of commercial rights is indeed very fascinating. The third aspect about the indicative of economic nationalism in East Africa consider decolonization as efforts to remake economic production, trade, and consumption is also a major takeaway. Kevin reminds us that political sovereignty in East Africa went hand in hand with economic sovereignty in the 1960s and throughout the 1970s. That indeed, the economic uplift was formative of political advance. Fifthly, Kevin articulates very well the struggles over cooperatives, export agencies, trade licenses, as an attempt by East Africans, call them credible citizens, to clamor for the long denied commercial liberties. For instance, the right to open shops, export their own crops, and receive loans, and in any case, more than political and cultural considerations. The sixth point I would like to point out is Kevin cautioning us about overemphasis of political and cultural histories that divorce economic aspect, to which scholars of 1990s are victims of this, namely citizens focusing on questions of race, ethnic identities, law, customary, cultural authenticity, and belonging. 7, Kevin has ably disentangled typologies of citizenship, more so in his conclusion, and particularly in Uganda, having shown the case of credible citizenship as a rather not attended to and a rarely researched on economic history by many historians who leverage political history. I have the 4 questions, and allow me pose them. Question number 1 is, what is your take on the nature of East African colonial economy as a deliberate attempt to monetize East African economies and integrate them into world capitalist economic systems? By this, I would like you to relate the credible citizenship, whether it is actually the credible citizenship, not a universe, an attempt by the colonial state to have a universal medium of exchange through commodification, penetration and expansion of European currencies, establishing of modern monetary systems, including credit systems you focus on today. Don't you think this was a deliberate attempt by the colonial state to integrate East African economies into a world capitalist system beyond what can be termed as credible citizens? Second, leaders of the seemingly credible citizens, were they not leading politicians of the political independent struggles. For instance, you refer to Musa as a credible producer, a credible leader of farmers, and even institutions becoming chief financiers of political activities. Are you not risking romanticizing economic infrastructure that serves political superstructure? The third question I would like to put to your attention is your reference on or reference to Chigezi as the most stuck with 8 times as many deposits collected as loans compared in East Africa. So when we compared Chigezi with the rest of the former labor reserve districts, you ably mentioned Toro, Ankole, Acholi, West Nile, and Winyoro. We relate it with the former cash crop centers that of course succeeded in monetary changes, and we are of course cash crop centers, East Mengo, West Mengo, Mubende, and Busoga. Even when cash crop growing had failed in Chigezi, why do you think that Chigezi was unique in that perspective? And this credible institution, a result of wage labor, which is an outcome of a monetized economy, a monetized economy that has its basis in the said banks and monetary systems. For instance, how would you estimate the importance of East African Currency Board that was established, of course, to regulate such currencies? The fourth and last question is about the conceptualization of credible citizenship. Where would you place credible citizenship in what I can categorize as historical, the 4 historical epochs, namely the first evolution of citizenship being the Greco-Roman times, where citizenship meant or was seen in terms of participation. Then the medieval, where citizenship was seen in terms of responsibility. Then in the 19th century there, citizenship metamorphosing into in terms of rights. Then in 20th century, where we now see the social citizenship, as you point out in your conclusion. Then there is the one I term as peculiar kind of citizenship, the practicing citizenship that has been pointed out by Mahmoudan in his Citizen and Subject, the decentralized despotism, in which I fear that this can fall there as East African and Africa generally to have these monetary policies to fit very well into this decentralized despotism. Or in any case, it could stand on its own right And if so, would you like to highlight some of such theoretical notions to which credible citizenship can fully stand on? Or even generally, can we go back to the political economy levels of the typologies of citizenship, namely the idiots who abuse and personalize power for their private use, tribesmen on the basis of the narrow tribal enclaves, and the actual citizen who actually works for the benefit of the whole community or the whole society. And then having that put into consideration, where does Thomas Humphrey Marshall's theory of social citizenship guide or misguide in your study? Thank you very, very, very much. I have enjoyed your presentation and looking forward to more interaction even after. Thank you.
No, I mean that's brilliant. Thank you for so much for such a careful and generative reading of this. I can't possibly do justice to everything you've just raised, but I think you're asking absolutely the questions that I need to work through. In part, this starting with this kind of older question of the integration into a world system. I would just say a couple things. I mean, I think I'm picking up on the tail end of that story that I broadly agree with about the kind of forced incorporation and monetization. I would point to a couple kind of complicating factors in that. One is the persistence of what I think of as like plural forms of value, that even with kind of widespread monetization, the capacity to kind of redirect worth or value or wealth into different forms of holdings, and that kind of continues to this day, whether it's the difficulty of commodifying land or an insistence on holding wealth in cryptocurrency that's not subject to the same sorts of extraction and governance by the Bank of Uganda, but it is certainly in a kind of interplay with it and its forms of money. The other thing is and trying to understand this kind of popular commercialism, productivism, is that the result merely of a kind of ideological project that turns people into enterprising accumulators, or is there something kind of longer standing about that? Do we see it as an older story, or one that's the result of missionary work and compelled labor regimes and so forth? I don't know that we have to have an answer to that, but I think we have to kind of like think through the ways that these forces become felt to be authentic, right? So whether people are, and this kind of goes into your second question, whether people are producers and accumulators as kind of like dupes, we might say simplistically, or whether they're just being forced to do so, whether I'm romanticizing the economic infrastructure which is actually serving political ends. I think no doubt the arrangement of the economy both before and after independence is serving political ends, but I think people genuinely feel it to be in their interests and something that they desire, and this is why I'm trying to think through what does it mean to write a history of kind of shared interests, moments in which people may have a shared interest with the Bank of Uganda or with the credit with the agricultural cooperatives versus moments in which that kind of interest fractures and you find that people are instead not selling their coffee and making sure it's properly dried so that they can sell it next year when the price is better, or taking it across the border to sell it for a better price, right? So that kind of question of how people come to understand themselves as having an interest which is aligned with a broader interest, I think is at the core of what I'm trying to work through here. I'll also note, I think a lot of discussions about kind of belonging focus on this question of inclusion versus exclusion. But I think there's another dynamic here, which you point to with the history of kind of incorporation into monetary economies, which is not the problem not being exclusion from these systems, but actually the enforced inclusion within these systems. So, for instance, the Bank of Uganda was central to the expropriation in 1972, and likewise, the kind of requirement to pay taxes in a certain currency, the requirement to be included within certain monetary infrastructures, I think is an ongoing dynamic. And whether SACCOs are subject to the same sorts of governance and therefore taxability, is a kind of contemporary version of that. So I think one of the things to do is to put enforced belonging into a polity or an economy next to the question of inclusion and exclusion. And that would be one way to, I think, kind of get at this question of, by finding a language to focus on producers, are we kind of ignoring the extractive, exploitative systems going on there? I think we have to do both. I know you're the expert here on Chigezi, so I actually would like to defer and would be keen to hear your answer to this, because I don't have a great answer to your third question about their position there and the importance of agricultural commerce and commercialized agricultural trade. So I'd be very keen on your thoughts on how that fits in and what I might be getting wrong there. And then, so this, I don't know if this kind of periodization, and I'd be quite keen to think through it more in your final point around the Greco-Roman medieval 19th, 20th century. I think, you mentioned kind of participation, responsibility, rights. All of those seem to be, laminated onto the period that I'm talking about. What I find to not exist in a kind of meaningful way, though I'm open to pushback on this, is the social, is the welfare. I think it was much more kind of delegated to individuals to find their own well-being in ways that were sanctioned by the state. Rather than something like what T.H. Marshall is talking about, and of course colonial officials are reading and influenced by, and therefore think they're doing in the colony. I think there's a risk of overstating that kind of welfarism, and I think instead there's something much more kind of entrepreneurial about it, and and then just the final thing is about how. If I'm right to some degree about the kind of prevalence of an economic citizenship here, what does that tell us about political rights, both as the focus of independence, but also as the kind of diminution of and the overriding of political rights in the decades after. Because I'm also telling a story of continuity across the major ruptures of Ugandan political history, and I think there is a continuity here that focusing only on a kind of political change may not capture. But yeah, I thank you again, and I hope I did some justice. But I think there's much more to be said here.
Thank you very much for that. Sorry, we keep getting power coming in and out, so we just lost the lights, but we can hear you. And I now just open the floor to questions and comments, both online and in the room. Just let me know if you have a a question, and I will. I see online. Yes, Julia, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I hope you'll excuse I'm leaving my camera off. It's very early here in Tennessee and I'm not quite camera ready. I'm a historian mainly of medicine and global health, but I'm embarking on a new project that's getting me into more economic and business history. And so this talk was enormously helpful, really interesting. And I was wondering if you could a little bit more about your sources. You mentioned the bank archives. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the nature of those archives, the kinds of documents in there, and then other sources that you may have brought to bear on this question and related questions.
Thank you. Yeah, so the Bank of Uganda, when I was doing research, I mean, at this point, almost a decade ago, was in the process of digitizing their entire collection, and it's a remarkable collection. It continues throughout the 70s and 80s, when, of course, you know, until more recent efforts by folks to make certain archives available, you know, that was a more difficult collection to find. And insights, it is not, I mean, there's quantitative data there to some extent, but it's at least from my perspective, surprisingly qualitative. There's a lot of kind of inspection reports of bank branches, but also markets. There's, you know, not insignificant kind of questions around supervision and fraud and counterfeiting, which you can imagine generates a lot of paperwork in a place like the BOU. There's material on economic planning and the kind of commanding heights of the state and thinking about redirecting resources. There is the files of the Uganda Commercial Bank are there, which are quite interesting. I also relied on the district level archives well, at the time in Fort Portal and in Jinja and a smaller collection in Mbale, which, you know, a lot of the complaints and petitions that I was looking at were about these issues. So people, you know, writing, as I suggested, demanding banks. There's part of this project is also about economic crimes in the 70s, and there's, you know, some of that holding material as well. So reports and offers to inspect people for hoarding or not selling or mispricing sugar or blankets or other desired goods by the mid and late 70s. And then I guess the final thing that kind of undergirded the first part of the talk was the East African Royal Commission, which is an enormous collection of petitions and submissions to it, which I think, you know, obviously there's a lot produced in the 1950s, but I found quite revealing as, you know, they toured around. You know, the actual report that they produce, I agree, it tends to be quite dull, but the submissions that were generated and written for it, I found, quite revealing of the different types of concerns that people had at the time.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to the book.
Thank you. We have. I'm sorry that our camera isn't on, but we have a question from Mamputi and Debesa. Please go ahead.
Thank you, presenter. Unfortunately, I don't know whether I will do justice to the response because we are disadvantaged. Some of us have not read your paper and have just heard a bit of your presentation. So that puts us to a disadvantage, but maybe let me make some comments. Mine are largely comments, and I want to thank the presenter for, if I understood him very well, that he uses this framework of analysis of inclusive citizenship, if I can call it that. There was a struggle for inclusivity, and therefore I could call it inclusive citizenship, if that expression can do justice to what you presented and what I'm thinking about. and particularly with reference to financial citizenship, especially in the banking sector. And relatedly, also how this inclusive citizenship struggles by the or by the marginalized, as some people would call them, the blatant in one sense, against colonial exploitation, colonial domination in the economic sector, and that actually inclusive citizenship or economic citizenship preceded political citizenship, political rights. Uganda. In your presentation or your research or your book is about, I think, the rise of economic citizenship in Uganda, with particular reference to the banking sector and public banking at that. And the struggle of the Africans using citizenship rights as an instrument for even bigger rights. That's why you see that this inclusive citizenship overlaps with identity citizenship and overlaps with social citizenship and other forms of citizenship. So that is how I am getting this this presentation, and much more so how the subalterns or the marginalized or the Africans used this inclusive citizenship as a weapon to overcome the exploitation and improve their lot in the course of decolonization and shortly after decolonization. But of course, it is overlapping with other challenges where you do point out also exclusion, where some ethnic groups or some regions now got more of the share at independence, and even in the 1950s, where some areas were left out. So the inclusive citizenship rights struggle continues even into independence, and that is the lesson I am learning here. However, the challenge is, if you are research, if you in the future maybe a recommendation for further research, is how this citizenship, inclusive citizenship rights, have been eroded by the post-colonial state, because there is no civic space. It is ironic that before independence or towards independence during the decolonization period, somehow, somewhere, the civic space for inclusive citizenship struggles was allowed, or at least there was a window. But since the Amin days and subsequently, almost this civic space is denied. You could not, for example, it is not easy today, or even during Idi Amin, and even during the Obote 1 government, Obote 2 government, for citizens to take up this cause of citizenship inclusion and be allowed to push it, because in 1950s, the citizens pushed this citizenship rights, and the colonial state yielded because it allowed this bank, the Savings and Credit Bank, it was put up, it was capitalized by the state, and you can see it helped to bring up the rights, economic rights of the Africans. Recently, for your information, if you are not following what is going on in Uganda, I think just last this year or just at the end of last year, President Museveni, the president of Uganda, lamented for having accepted the Bank of Uganda advice to privatize all banks. The commercial banker you are talking about, the Uganda Credit and Services Bank, which later became the commercial bank. It was later sold to a South African conglomerate, Stanbic Bank today. And it is about profits. Its obligation is profit. Its obligation is not citizens serving the citizens. And there is no space now. Even these struggles we are talking about are not there. Because if you do it now, you will be met by the wrath of the state more than the colonial state did. So it is ironic that the citizenship struggles that led to citizenship rights, economic rights, have now been eroded almost to the point of nothing. That's the unfortunate thing. So I wish the further research could look at these citizenship inclusion struggles and see how they have evolved and look at more details of the rise and fall of citizenship struggles in Uganda, with particular reference to economic citizenship or more so financial citizenship. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. I mean, and the question of structural adjustment looms large here, and the kind of exclusion of political claims making as a result of the kind of dominance of a market mentality, to which, the question of privatizing banks and a regret about that is absolutely relevant. But the ability of people to kind of make political claims through an idiom or of the market is also interesting, right? That one can kind of claim to be serving the nation or an appropriate political subject because of one's economic activity. What kind of possibilities does that offer in certain historical conjunctures, and what does it foreclose? I think is absolutely the kind of space for that I would like to kind of continue pressing on, as you suggest.
Thanks very much, Dr. Kevin. From the presentation, I observed that unlike today, where citizenship may be granted to someone either by registration or by birth or any other aspect, I'm seeing that at that point, if I can quote the presentation of Musaz, more of the citizenship was based on production. A credible citizen was that one who produced maybe in surplus and fed the colonial masters. Then my concern is, what about those who did not produce? Weren't they citizens? And which term can we use to determine this kind of people? Because I know some were the majority, especially in Acholi and other parts of Uganda. So my concern is that, as Professor said, that there was some kind of inclusion, I'm seeing too much of exclusion basing on production. And my understanding, can we base on production to say that this was a credible citizen? I think this was the genesis why most of the people, much as Musaz was a good producer, again came out and championed the riots and forming the political parties that later on helped the marginalized to be heard in the history of Uganda. Thank you.
Should we take, let's just take for time's sake, because we only have about 20 minutes, take a couple of questions and then you can respond to both at a time. So Christopher, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kevin, and thank you very much, Dr. Mwambusia, for those interesting comments and questions. They are a learning kind of process for us. This is an interesting kind of work Dr. Kevin is doing. Actually, it is coming in the right time, especially when we have more kind of scholarly work that is coming up. I'm referring to Uganda and Indian colony, 1897 to 1972, by Professor Samuel Lwanga Lunyigo, who is giving an account about the occupation and economic running of the Indians in Uganda. And when I look at what you're presenting, or what your work is presenting to us, the credible citizenship, you said in your introduction, when you were presenting economic sovereignty and self-determination. And in this book, Professor Lwanga Lunyigo is saying actually Uganda wasn't economically independent until 1972. I don't know if in your research, in archives you interrogated, you found any kind of data concerning about what Professor Lwanga Lunyigo calls an economic war, and why would we have an economic war if we had this kind of, citizen calling for inclusion, calling for economic transformation and participation. We know that in 1897, this is when the Indians started coming in East Africa, and unlike in Kenya, like Professor Lwanga Lunyigo is saying, the settlers, the white settlers in Kenya occupied some of the best lands. But when it came to Uganda, this land was actually given, provided to the Indians, whom actually were also colonized back home. And why do we see that kind of movement being actually supported by the British colonial government here? And yet they were also being colonizing those people there. So my question would be is, like, who were really the controllers of economic progress of Uganda in the 50s and of course post-independence? Because we see even today, actually, if you go to social media, there are very many people who are actually complaining about citizenship, who is to be granted citizen, who is not. We have a section of the Bavandimwe, for example, who have lived here for some good time, and these guys, they've always complained that they're not given passports. And so my question in that regard, who decides who to be a citizen? Maybe it could also be a recommendation to really understand what does it mean to be a citizen in Uganda today. When you look at in the 50s or before the independence and post-independence, what does it mean to be a citizen in Uganda? What does it require for somebody to be a citizen in Uganda? Yeah, so thank you very much. That is my submission for now.
So thanks. Can we just take one more question? Then, I think it's also both those questions getting at who's allowed to be considered productive in what you've put forward. So Jonathan, please.
So the question is, I wonder whether your sources I continue. Well, I restart. Okay, so I wonder whether your sources allowed you to determine or to find out the degree to which people's standards were improved. Thank you so much.
So do you want to respond to those, and we'll see if we have time for another set of questions.
Thank you so much. I'll start with the last question. I was identified as an economic historian by one of the commenters, and I always retreat from such a label because I'm almost fully innumerate and cannot make any kind of claims to tracking people's improvements in standards of living. I would certainly rely on others to do so. I think it's clear that the expansion of commercial cropping in the 50s was buoyed by the higher export prices, but no doubt also by the new resources available, also the ability to transfer into new sectors, so not merely growing coffee or cotton, but being able to get access to a license to run a shop or buy a vehicle and get into the transport business. And likewise, there's a series of other changes that I'm not giving enough attention to in the 50s, including the kind of purchase and repurposing of ginneries for African cooperatives, so that there are other things going on, which are, of course, inflected by race, which brings to the kind of second and first questions. The expulsion, the question of kind of the racial capitalism of the colony are certainly informing my argument here. I'm trying to kind of demonstrate that they have to be seen within a kind of wider situation than merely the kind of Asian dominance and racial thought and argument, that there's something to which those fit into. But who gets to be productive is absolutely, the right way to frame this, and who gets to be a citizen. And I think there are various kind of genealogies and forces and struggles at play here. So we know from 72 that, it is not birth that is sufficient to give one a firm grounding as a citizen. It is not a passport. It is not registration alone, right? There are other forces at play here. And likewise, it is not productivity or the generation of wealth alone that gives one a durable claim to belonging within the country. There's at least two other things going on. One is whether you are generating wealth or value that you are allowing to be governed by the state, its infrastructures and instruments, right? So the specter of money flowing out through Asian networks, is about the kind of perforation of the national monetary economy, which is a novelty, right? I mean, there is a regional currency. There was free circulation of currency under the East African Currency Board. There was free circulation of currency within the sterling zone prior to the creation of the Uganda shilling and the Bank of Uganda, and the imposition of stronger and stronger foreign exchange controls over time, right? So the ground shifts, and therefore the kind of expectation about where wealth is generated and located and governed, and therefore to what ends it can be put, shift. And that is absolutely a kind of process of struggle, but also larger kind of global forces around the kind of delimitation of political belonging after decolonization. And I think it's useful to, kind of put this next to a kind of gendered history as well. So who gets to be productive? Who gets to be deemed to produce value? It's not merely those who are producing value that are deemed to be producing value, right? And so the initiative of feminist scholars and activists to demonstrate that women are essential, and have been for decades and decades and decades, to the monetary economy, not merely a kind of subsistence or domestic economy, essential here. So this is why Christine Obo's work is so important in that moment, is to demonstrate how women were both important to the cash crop economy and occluded from it, but also to a kind of market economy, an urban economy by the 70s. And yet they are not recognized as such, and they don't get the same sort of resources as such. That starts to change, I think, globally, 70s, 80s, there's more kind of international attention to this, as well as in the, kind of post, the NRM government, right, and the kind of force of women activists and politicians there as well. So, yeah, what about those who did not produce? Are they citizens? You know, what form of citizenship? You know, certainly in some cases, yes. You know, the kind of the legal apparatus around citizenship allows one to have a certain purchase on the state and its resources, and you know, one's own rights by dint of a kind of legalistic belonging. My effort is to kind of point to like the meaningfulness of citizenship, and that in important ways, what made citizenship meaningful was not legal recognition alone, nor was it, you know, birth or genealogy or location. It was in part about one's ability to fit within this ideology that showed that who was really deserving of a kind of enduring support and protection were those who could, you know, to simplify, earn dollars and sterling and other, you know, through coffee exports. You know, there's many other, you know, versions of this, right? But I am trying to kind of emphasize the foreign exchange reserve that was so central and remains so central. You know, in Kenya right now, right? You know, we have a kind of concern about dollar shortages. You know, this kind of hidden importance of foreign exchange holdings that the state claims, you know, to govern, demands to govern in this period, is the kind of kernel that I'm trying to work around and show the kind of struggles that are entailed by that.
Thanks, and I'm looking for hands as well, but something that comes up with that, I'll just add my point and then go to Stephen, is, you know, I don't know, it seems to me there's issue of like how wage labor is understood is critical, whether partially because many people, you know, right through the 1950s and 1960s, many wage laborers who are in the banking system, some are working for Indian merchants, or are in. It struck me that Busoga was also one of the heavily banked areas. I don't know if that's whether, you know, William over here may have some ideas about why that is, but it could. I suspect probably part of that is also wage labor, and sort of how, you know, so it's not just about leveraging land, it's also about leveraging you know, a participation in an urban economy that in other spheres was considered suspicious and immoral, but that provided some leverage to enter the banking system. So it seems that part of it is that there's a tension between those often who are most able to enter the banking system. That can be a source of, just to see it through, you know, social or intellectual history, that can be seen as, oh, they're productive, they're participating in the system. It can also be seen as suspicious, that they're sort of, you know, where their money can be controlled, but where does their money come from? Like, it doesn't get rid of these concerns about people can be banked and can be subject to you know, the banking system and still be excluded in all kinds of other ways. And so I thought, you know, maybe I don't know if there's something that you want to comment there. I think it's not just about the, you know, Asian expulsion. It's also just about how other people who were embedded in that economy and are perceived, you know, from the you know, 50s onward. And Stephen, please.
Yes,
go
thank
ahead.
you so much. My question is in regard to the supremacy of the laws by that time that were in Uganda. I would like to know the lawful codes that were governing the economy in Uganda by that time that propelled the Ugandans to struggle for inclusiveness, because the presenter has not tackled something of the kind to enlighten us more about why there was a desire for inclusiveness in the economy of Uganda by that time. Thank you. What were those laws that were governing the economy of Uganda by 1950s that propelled the Ugandans to struggle for inclusiveness, especially in the economy at that time. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Yes, please. You'll have to use the microphone here.
Thank you, Dr. Kevin, for your presentation. As I read the topic and try to synthesize some of the things we've learned here, cultivating credible citizenship in decolonizing Uganda. What has been going through my mind is with this introduction of money economy or banking, to whose advantage was it actually instituted or established? Because I know you made mention of at a point, the IMF solution and those stars. And we know, the basic that we know, IMF runs on 3 principles that economy or a state should be able to export more than it imports, and government should not involve itself in employing a lot of citizens. Then there should be that level where money is devalued, devaluation of money, those things. So we know that the issue of banking and those things do well in capitalist economy. And that is why I think during the economic recession, the Bretton Woods had to come up with something, then contribute or find a way of helping the UK out of the situation. So looking at those factors, would you consider that it was an ideal to promote the common good of the Ugandans, or it was still running capitalist interest? Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have a comment online. I don't know if Lillian and Babazi, if you'd like to ask the question or just have us to read it for those who are in the room.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. My internet was a bit unstable. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Donovan, for that inciting presentation of your book and sharing of the work on credible citizenship. What I take from your presentation is that certainly the policies that were passed then, specifically by the bank, were cementing existing inequalities. Yeah. And I look at women specifically, who you indicated, of course, yeah, some owned land, but that is a very small fraction compared to the population of the women in the country then. And I'm thinking, might we have to think of layered definitions of citizenship then in view of in a patriarchal setting like Uganda, specifically in the years that you're looking at? That was my question. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you all. I love this language of layered definitions, Lillian. I think that's quite helpful and yeah, puts these kind of different aspects in a nice way. On the and you know, it kind of like allows a way to bring in the legal, which was, I think, was it Stephen's question. So I think there's a range of things here, you know, including trade licensing laws, the export boards, the marketing boards being really crucial since the 1944, that are requiring people to sell through certain channels and are, you know, accumulating very large holdings through the price stabilization funds. And there's also a question for colonial officials, like, what do we do with this? There's a way of turning it into a loan is a way to not lose that fund, if it gets repaid, which was an if at the time, but it also doesn't. There's a way that, like, oh, I'm following commercial logic here rather than, say, investing in a hospital in Acholi, right, which would have kind of overt politics around it. So there's something about routing it through commercial, parastatal commercial channels that has a way of muting the questions of redistribution that are being undertaken. The co-ops, the cooperative marketing is important here as well. But then, the kind of other law that's, or legal regime or legal culture maybe that's relevant is the lack of lending and the rules against lending to Africans because of this specter of over-indebtedness, which the Asian merchant money lender was often the kind of figure informing British policy, despite the centrality of counter credit and so forth to kind of everyday economies in Uganda. The kind of prohibitions or limits on lending, and certainly the austerity of the British regime not wanting to spend a lot of money to Africans or on Africans through the loans. The question of the IMF is interesting. I think there's a risk of reading from the 90s forward backwards to the, say, 1960s. I wouldn't overstate my position too far, but let me just put it out, kind of speaking from the hip, which is that at the time, the IMF and the East African Currency Board disagreed about all sorts of things. From the perspective of the East African Currency Board, the IMF was this new kid on the block that weren't from London and were advising governments to do different sorts of things, including set up central banks that the East African Currency Board didn't want to be done in 1962, 63, 64. And so there's a quite a clear struggle over there, right? So, and in that moment, actually, the East African Currency Board is doing more in terms of holding the value low of the currency, encouraging the free circulation of capital. They are the kind of more conservative force than the IMF, who wants to create monetary and fiscal space for the states to pursue a more aggressive developmentalism. And so who is is that the IMF that we know today, or is that a different kind of institution? I think is an open question. And the other thing that matters here is, why I think the 60s and 70s are distinct is the maintenance of the Bretton Woods system and the kind of fixed exchange rates to gold and the US dollar, where, when that falls apart, and starts to affect East Africa by the mid to late 70s, then we're in a different question where you can devalue quite aggressively, right? Or you can be forced to devalue quite aggressively. But that's not the case before then, right? When we have fixed exchange rates. So I think there's something different. I mean, no doubt. I think, kind of economic development is serving certain interests, which are not everyone's interests. But, that's a kind of minority view in many circles, and certainly at the time there's a vocal and loud and influential group, which I don't think is reducible to one kind of well-formed class that's speaking on its own behalf. I think it's a more diffuse expectation that development will come with 1962, and that the state's responsibility is to push financial and monetary resources out, and that's not a kind of elite against the people. I think it is a much more kind of bottom-up demand that people are making.
Thank you very much. We're past 4 o'clock, but this has been really a fascinating discussion, I think, for both to think about sources, about citizenship, about economic history, and we're really grateful for your presentation and for Dr. Tununuche's comments. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
And I should just mention that, well, first that Dr. Donovan will be here in person in August, I believe. So we're looking forward to asking more questions and interacting with you then. And then secondly, that next week we have 2 seminars. One on Wednesday, a book seminar with Professor Godfrey Asimwe, and then on Friday, a seminar with Professor Ebike Kasozi about Abu Mayanja and his time going from Makerere to London. So please join us for those seminars if you can. Just to note that the seminar with Professor Kasozi will have a pre-circulated paper. I know that Professor Ndebesa likes those, so we'll have that for next week. You can get that by contacting me on email. And I hope you'll be able to join us. So thank you again.